In 2017, I quit my job to travel the world, and then everything fell apart. It's been 3.5 years now since I left my job at Google and my comfy life in New York City and booked a one-way ticket to Tunisia. I wanted to escape the monotony of ordinary life, explore the world, and live out the narrative that I saw popular travel bloggers, who are my friends, boasting about. And at the beginning, I did. I rode ATVs in the Sahara Desert in Tunisia. I climbed Mount Toubkal, and I road tripped in a camper van through the valleys of Morocco. And I sipped wine in Argentina while overlooking Iguazu Falls. I had no intention of blogging, but I really enjoy writing, so I put up some articles on the internet, and one was picked up by a top business news site in India, and another went viral in Tunisia. I was meeting hundreds of wonderful people on the internet and in real life. Life was pretty sweet, and I was under budget. Things were going really well until the unexpected happened. I was on a cargo boat, sailing up the Rio Paraguay to the remote jungles of the Pantanal, when I had a brief moment of cell service, and I saw a message that made my heart stop. A family member of mine was very ill and needed to be hospitalized, and I needed to rush home. I remember my mind raced as I plotted my escape back to civilization. I looked at my map and my little GPS dot, and I reasoned that I could sneak my way back into Brazil, and so I hopped off the cargo boat at the next stop, which was this tiny island in the middle of the river. And it was dark, but in the moonlight, I could see Brazil in the distance. And I remember there were locals that were by a fire, they were dancing merrily and looking inquisitively at us. I remember that moment vividly because a part of me longed to join them, because I knew in my heart that it would be a very long time before I would be able to return. But I noticed that one had a boat. So we cut a ride to the other side, and I found the nearest hotel with Wi-Fi and booked the earliest flight back to Boston that I could find from the closest city, and made my journey home, putting an abrupt end to my grand adventure. What follows is a very personal story that not many know about, but I want to share a piece of it now and what I learned from the experience that followed, because I think many of you might be feeling the way that I did at the time during this pandemic. Feelings of uncertainty, isolation, and loss of control. While most of my friends thought that I was gallivanting around the world still, I was actually back home in New Bedford, unemployed and playing the role of caretaker. And I love my hometown, New Bedford, but it's not very exotic. Instead of planning my next crazy adventure and sleeping in tents and hostels, I was planning my next hospital visit and spending the night in emergency rooms. And the money I had saved for traveling, I repurposed to pay for healthcare and credit card bills. How different my life had become, I thought. And I couldn't shake the resentment I felt towards the world while I watched from afar as my best friends lived their lives and traveled the world as I had intended for myself. For a while, I dropped off of social media. After all, my life was no longer Instagram worthy. My narrative had fallen apart, so I stopped writing. I didn't really have a plan when I quit my job, but whatever it was, this was not it. But if there's anything I've learned from backpacking, it's that nothing ever goes according to plan. And sometimes things go absurdly wrong and you end up stranded in the middle of nowhere in the Namibian desert at a border post with no money or place to sleep. Or stuck in a storm at night at the peak of Mount Fuji, unable to find your way down. These are just a couple of examples of real-life pickles I have gotten myself into while on the road. The first step to handling any situation, I've learned, is managing my emotions. Taking a breath and accepting the situation at hand, and turning it around and approaching it as a challenge that I need to figure out how to overcome. At least this will make a good story, is what I usually tell myself during those times. It's too easy to think about all the mistakes and wrong turns you made that led to the predicament in the first place. And if you dwell on them, you don't have time to think for solutions. I had to accept that my year was not going to be a real-life rendition of Around the World in 80 Days. I had to free myself from the limitations of having that expectation, because it was leading me to feeling bitter and disappointed, which then led me to feeling ashamed for being selfish for feeling that way, and that wasn't good for me or anybody else in my life. Expectations give you a false sense of entitlement, so get rid of them. Now, inevitably, in these situations, your mind will always jump to the worst possible scenarios. What if I get hypothermia on the mountain? Or become dehydrated in the desert? Or in this case, what if I lose a loved one? It's important that you accept that whatever happens will happen. And it's possible that the worst could happen, but often that's statistically unlikely. For example, if you are sick and you Google your symptoms, there's a good chance that WebMD will tell you that there is a chance that you are dying. But if you do more research, you'll probably find that the likelihood is not at all significant. So don't panic. And at any rate, there's always hope. There's no point in panicking because all you can do now is do the best you can with what you have, and what you have is no choice but to adapt to the new challenge ahead. The point of all of this is to ensure that your emotions are working for you and not against you, so that you have the mental energy to focus on the useful things, like objectively appraising the situation and imagineering solutions, while keeping in mind that whatever you plan will probably fall apart because that's what plans do. But anyway, to begin, I always ask myself one important question. What are the things I can control? Sometimes it's difficult to answer, but I find that it's much easier to identify these things if I imagine that I am an objective third party looking down at myself, as if I were the main character of the Truman Show. What would I tell myself to do? How would I want myself to feel? If the problem is with other people, I always take a moment to also consider things from their perspective. Another very useful vantage point is to picture myself in the future, maybe 6 months or a year from now. What can I do now that would make my future self proud of herself when she looks back on this time? When it's over, what can I take away from this experience? I knew I would be proud of myself for sticking around during a difficult time and being supportive. I also knew that if I wanted to provide any emotional support, I had to get my own emotions sorted out. Now, I don't believe that everything happens for a reason, but I do believe that you have the power to choose to give things meaning. And we tend to do this in retrospect, but the greatest value comes when we use foresight, because it forces you to think optimistically, to consider actions you can take in the future, rather than dwelling on the past. Everything may feel out of your control, but the one thing you always have power over is how you react. And by reminding myself of this each day, I was able to stay optimistic in the face of trauma and learn how to make the most of my time each day, regardless of the circumstances. One of the things that I did to keep myself grounded during this time was writing and journaling and picking that back up. I learned just because my narrative didn't turn out to be what I wanted, that didn't mean that I should put the pen down. And so what began as an outward journey to explore the world and meet new people turned into a very inward, reflective journey. But I learned that that can be just as valuable. The lessons I learned about how to make my own emotions work for me and not against me have stuck with me, particularly during times of unexpected change. This pandemic is no different. I quickly accepted that 2020 was not going to be what I expected. It was going to be different, and I needed to reset all of my expectations. And then I focused on doing as much research as possible to gauge the likelihood of various scenarios, favoring research, academic research and academic articles, as opposed to mass media articles, because the latter tend to feed off of your mind's tendency to imagine the worst possible scenarios in order to garner clicks, which then leads to panic, which I religiously avoid, and as we all should. And based on my research on the trajectory of COVID in every other city and country, and the outcome of various responses, I could objectively appraise the situation. And I determined that the only thing I had any control over at the time was deciding how and where I wanted to spend my time in isolation. So I focused my energy on that. I was in Colombia, and now that my office was closed, I realized that this could be my opportunity to escape city life and live out the dream I once had of being a vagabond, albeit in quarantine. Now, a lot of things can go wrong staying abroad during a global pandemic, but when I thought about future me, who loves adventure, I knew that she would not regret taking a chance on this calculated risk. I ended up spending the first 6 weeks quarantined in an apartment on my own in Colombia, but despite being physically isolated, I didn't feel isolated. I didn't quit social media. I used it as a tool to connect with people. I used the free time I had to pursue all the creative, more introverted hobbies I picked back up years ago when I was back living at home, like writing and music, things that often took a back seat to my social life in New York. I even discovered new hobbies like Play-Doh and balloon arts. Granted, the latter will probably not become lifelong passions. They were born out of sheer boredom. But the point is that I had learned how to stay calm and positive in the face of uncertainty, even if I was completely alone, stranded in a foreign country. And by accepting the situation and approaching it as a challenge, I turned a problem into an opportunity that led me on a wild and unexpected quarantine adventure in Colombia and brought my narrative full circle back to the jungles of South America. So remember, just because your story is taking a turn that you didn't expect and may not want, your perspective is what matters most. So don't ever stop writing. Thank you.